under occupancy thing, isn't it? Now, when you started that, I have to say I was behind you, and even your mate James from LBC was behind you there.
My mate James? I didn't have a mate James at LBC.
No, I was probably being slightly sarcastic. Chap you've had an argument with on the radio.
Oh yes, well I wouldn't worry about him.
But I'm saying that he was behind you, I think, a year ago, as was I. In that, I think you're right where you're coming from. In that there are people crying out for houses with bedrooms, and there are people who do have their spare bedrooms. But I think the way it's being administered, it's not working, is it?
Well, I think it is working, but you know.
You think it's working, but at the moment there are 48% of people in social housing who are in arrears, and apparently they can't move when they're in arrears.
No, it's not actually the case. The reality is that councils themselves are capable of making decisions about whether people can move depending on what those arrears are for. And we've given a huge amount of discretionary money to councils so that they can ease that process over a period of a year or two, so that people can both do swaps, they can move as necessary if they want to, or in some cases they can stay put, and they can pay the extra money for those extra rooms. Well, I simply said to them, it's the council's decision how they do it, but what we can't do is have taxpayers go on subsidising people to have spare rooms when there are people who live in overcrowded accommodation and sitting on waiting lists. We have to build more homes, we know that, which is why the number of houses being built in social property is actually rising. It's larger than it was, but we inherited a very bad position where social housing was down to the lowest levels of build since the 1920s. So there's a lot of that is all part of the package, but it takes time.
But why are there people, if there are 48% in social housing in arrears, but why should they have the extra stress of having to pay more and more their debt, increasing because they can't move, because otherwise they wouldn't, if they want to move and there isn't housing for them to go to, they're being penalised twice, aren't they? And then they've got to find moving costs.
No, one of the reasons why people get into arrears is that they're living in a house that they can't necessarily afford to run other than the rent. If you live in a house that's too big for you, it costs to heat it. It costs because the general cost of running a house that's large and which you don't fully use and others aren't contributing to is an expensive process. So the reality is some of the best things that can happen for people who live in large houses to be in smaller houses, much more accommodating, much easier to look after, and also generally cheaper to run. So the real point about this is councils for years have not attended to managing their properties properly because we paid the rent direct for social tenants, therefore it didn't really matter to them in many cases. What's actually happening now is that councils are having to think very carefully about where they put people in houses, what kind of housing that they build. You know, the demand for housing at the moment, about 61% is for one-bedroom housing. It's not for three-bedroom housing, it's for one-bedroom housing, not even for two-bedroom housing. But if you look at what councils have been building over the last few years, it's much bigger properties. And the answer is, it's not efficient for people to live in properties that they don't necessarily occupy. So my point to councils is, you have to manage this property, you have to manage it so that people get the kind of housing they need, so that others who may need larger housing, with families, etc., can actually at last find themselves in houses where their children can at least not be overcrowded and therefore probably perform better at school. So all of those things are part of the reason for the policy.
I quite agree with you.
And the reason we've given councils large sums of money, and we have, record large sums of money for discretionary payments to help people to either make those moves, if they're staying put, to give them time to sort their finances out. If they've had to have alterations made to houses, they can make alterations to houses they're moving to. There's record numbers now on house swap programs which exist all over the country. So all of that is part of the process of trying to get this managed properly, that's all.
So why the National Housing Association
Federation
saying that 48% are in arrears, and that they found that 66% of their residents hit by the bedroom tax, that's not bedroom tax, are in rent arrears, with more than a third of them reported to be in debt because they were unable to pay this recent under occupancy?
Well, first of all, there is no wide-scale view about what these arrears are all about. Some arrears exist, a lot of them exist historically, because councils themselves have not managed that process properly. So some people have been in arrears for a little while. Some councils are very poor at managing their finances, others are better. Some housing associations are in the same category. Some of the very good ones manage their tenants much better to ensure that their tenants don't fall into arrears. Some of them, I think Notting Hill's a very good one, for example, where they actually manage tenants being back into work, they take an interest in what's happening to them. So not all housing associations, like all councils, are exactly the same. Some are good and some are not so good. I don't agree with the housing federations paper on this one. I don't believe that this is all down to government policy. The reality is many councils have incurred arrears long before any of the welfare reforms came in, and they should have been managing that better. So, we are at the moment trying to get housing associations and councils to manage their property better, to ensure their tenants don't fall into arrears, and ensure most of all that they're actually living in houses they can afford to live in, rather than being in houses which cost them too much money to run. It's getting the balance right between what the need is for different groups of people. There is a finite resource here, and the housing benefit bill rocketed under the last government in the last 10 years. It doubled in 10 years, which is unprecedented, frankly, from around 10 or 11 billion to about 20 billion, and was set to rise another 5 billion during the course of this parliament if I hadn't started trying to get it back under control. And at the end of the day, we can go on about saying we should spend more money, but, the people that it actually costs money for are average rate taxpayers, who themselves are having to make decisions about the housing they live in, and cutting their cloth in accordance with the amount of money they've got. So I have to get the balance right between these things, and fairness to those who are actually paying taxes is as important as fairness to those who are living in social housing.
Absolutely.
Many people may well be themselves
those of us
paying
who've never
tax.
lived on benefits and have paid our taxes all our lives, absolutely, and that's why I can see where you're coming from, but I still think it's being administered very quickly, and it's all very well saying it's got to be this better, it's got to be that better, but what about the councils who are inefficient? Frankly, I worked for one several years ago.
Well, they have to get themselves sorted out, because at the end of the day, they won't survive as running housing, because the answer is you have to sort this out.
Yeah, but then what happens to the people? What happens to the people? It's all very well saying the local authority are inefficient.
Well, what's happening?
With
respect, what's happening to them now? Ask yourself this question: why have we allowed people living in social housing to be treated like they've been treated for so long? In other words, their real needs have not been attended to. What's actually been happening is councils have simply just put them where they felt they wanted to put them. This policy will help redirect councils to start thinking, and housing associations, about where they're putting people, sustainably. You're putting somebody in a house they cannot sustain their lives in. That's not very kind to them. You end up in a massive amount of temporary property, and very badly managed properties too. The whole point about all of the housing benefit changes we're making, not just the spare room subsidy, sorting out the local housing allowance, which was set at a ridiculous rate, was causing a massive boom in cost in rental properties in London. All of this has been tough decisions we've had to take, because this is about getting authorities and associations to manage the people in their properties better, so they get better property more sustainably, so they don't end up having to shift them around all the time because they've got them in the wrong property. And for those that have to have property, decent property, they don't get put into houses that are too big for them, they can't manage.
No, I understand.
So all of that is the balance of it. There is no easy.
When do you think it's going to suddenly rectify itself?
It isn't suddenly going to rectify.
No,
it rectifies
really
over
a
period of time. And that's what you have to start. But if you don't start, it doesn't change. And what we've had is an unsustainable position. So I say, if housing benefit has doubled in 10 years and was set to go on rocketing up, then there is something fundamentally wrong with the system that was administering it. So what I'm trying to do here through the housing benefit changes is to get this back under control. These things are never going to be easy, but they have to be done. And for those
and I appreciate that. As a change manager myself, people don't like change, it's difficult, but it's
already having an effect. We're already hearing from local authorities are making big changes, lots of them are getting involved in many more house swaps. Numbers of them are using their money very cleverly and carefully to make sure that people actually get sustained positions. They're looking to help people move. They're changing the way they policy on building property again now. They're looking much more towards, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom properties for people.
And what are you doing about good practice sharing that with the local authorities that are rubbish?
My department and the Department for Local Government spends their whole time telling people what everybody else is doing, and sharing of best practice is one of the areas that we are keen to do even more of.
And to go over to another local authority and look at how they're doing.
Local authorities ultimately are run by the councillors, and so what we have to do is ensure they have the details in hand and hope that they will be sensible about what they do. I mean, it's for people to decide whether they want those same people running them at the end of the day. Well,
you can hope. It's not always down to who's around the table, is it? It's around to chief execs and managers who promote people beyond their capabilities.
But many of them have known about this coming in for 3 years, and an awful lot of them didn't do anything about it for 3 years in terms of their house building programme. They knew very well that the need for one.
But did they have enough funding to build the houses?
Yes, it's funding all the time. It's part of what the way that funding is given for building property. That's how it works. The question is, what do you build with that money? That's the question left to local authorities and housing associations.
Oh well, let's move on.